Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War News Update, first part there for the 13th of May 2024. I've done this already. I did a 48-minute video, and because my audio settings got changed last night in a live on Tochny, it's a really good live, go and check it out. I was on at about 1 hour 15 onwards for a couple of hours, really good chat. But it changed my audio settings and I should have checked, and I have 48 minutes of my life. And I'm going to have to say exactly the same thing now. I'll try and say it quicker. Right. Record numbers overnight. And that is going to be because Kharkiv offensive is in full swing. And you will, I mean, it's no surprise. You had record numbers already taking place in terms of Russian losses with the front line in the east and in the south and to some degree on Dnipro River. So all of that front line was giving us record numbers, and then you are starting a massive offensive up in Kharkiv that is involving perhaps, you know, five brigades attacking down there. You're going to add that onto record numbers, you're going to get super record numbers. And apparently all the information that I'm seeing is that the Russians are taking huge losses up in Kharkiv. So the good news about that is go and check out Jake Bro's video last night looking at, well, the distance they've got to go to get to Kharkiv is the same as, is more than what they've taken in Avdiivka, the Russians, in 2 years. And so, you know, the Russians could really struggle, but are they really trying to realistically take Kharkiv? Or is it about giving a buffer zone to stop Ukrainian artillery hitting Belgorod, so on and so forth? What are the objectives? But whatever the objectives are, the Russians are taking some pretty heavy casualties. And you can see that 1,740 personnel lost is a phenomenally high number. It's just 300, almost 300 above what we had previously seen, and that was already an incredibly high number. So it's just insane stats here. 31 tanks lost is a phenomenal number of tanks to lose in a single day. It's just incredible. And again, if you take 30% off, that's still 20 tanks lost in a day. If you take 30% off 1,740, you are still at 1,200 troops lost. 1,300 troops lost, and that's with a 30%, over egging the stats. 42 armored personnel vehicles lost is a huge number. 15 artillery systems is not that high. It's actually one below the average, so that's a lower one. 4 multiple launch rocket systems is high for that category. 59 vehicles and fuel tanks is well over average, and 6 pieces of special equipment. So we are seeing these just huge numbers of equipment taken out and personnel. This is unsustainable sorts of losses. It really is. I mean, if this is record numbers in some of these categories, and I've said previously these are unsustainable losses, then these are really unsustainable losses. And this then goes back to, so I'm kind of like, oh, you know, is Kharkiv, will they have some success, the Russians? And they are going to take some land and they are going to occupy villages. But at the end of the day, the question is it worth it? And the Russians are, I'm sure, going to lose more troops there than if they had committed all of those troops to, say, Avdiivka or Chasiv Yar, or no, I really do still think this was not a well-advised offensive vector, but you know, I could easily be proven wrong. Now, we will come back to Kharkiv later in the last section of this video. Let's go and look at some of the other videos that I think are important to consider. So the first one, or not videos, but pieces of information. First one is the strike on the Paradise restaurant that took place on the 11th of May. This was celebrating the 10th anniversary of the referendum on the creation of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. It happened in Donetsk city at a restaurant there, and apparently 4 officers were killed and 2 servicemen of the Spetsnaz brigades of special forces. So that was a high-value target, which is why, you know, you saw a HIMARS, you know, hit a restaurant. The question the Russians will be asking is, how did that information get out? What intelligence leaks do we have? And also, you know, is it worth getting together for these commemorations, where it's not the first time that such an event has caused some really significant deaths? This video has been shown on Andrew Perpetua's live stream. Of course, that was going to happen. Here we have a BTR, a sort of armored personnel vehicle carrier getting stuck on a mine, hit by a mine, but it's after the mine hits that is amazing. So look at the number of people that get out of this vehicle. It is absolutely phenomenal. I've shown you videos like this before where I've pointed out exactly the same thing. And this is yet another one where you've got, I mean, you've already got three odd people getting out that way, three odd people getting out that way. Then when we come back to here, they're like, I mean, it does look like ants coming out of an ant's nest here from this kind of distance. But there has to be at least 20 people in that BTR. Well, one is good news for the Russians that the BTR can withstand a mine and not lead to casualties, it appears. So it does its job, but in its protective job. But that you are seeing two vehicles here, and both do get hit. The first one gets hit a little bit later. I think it carries on. You have two vehicles, one of which has 20 plus people in, where normally you would have seen a dozen vehicles with far fewer people in each. So it's not just like, oh, look how many people can fit into that BTR. The observation here is they're not using enough vehicles. Why are they not using enough vehicles? Why are they having to cram men into a BTR like sardines into a can? What is making them do that? And it has to be a lack of vehicles. Why are they attacking only with two vehicles in an attack with that amount of men that would normally have used like 3 or 4 vehicles? And actually, normally they might have attacked with a dozen vehicles or 2 dozen vehicles. And again, it's like lack of equipment. It has to be that. There are so many videos coming out. So when we're talking about like record stats, you would also expect to see a huge number of videos showing lots of people and equipment being destroyed or killed and injured. Actually, that is what we're seeing as well. I have seen plenty. Jane Kiev here says the amount of videos I'm seeing of Russian troops getting slaughtered is an all-time high. It's just crazy right now. This one is from the Eastern Front. There's some, lots and lots of videos here. You've got a whole bunch of people being taken out by drones. You've got them lining up into a trench. And on the one hand, you think, oh, these poor human beings are just, they're being just taken out with precision by these drones. You got this line of people in the trench that get hit at that end of the line, so they start running that way. They get that end of the line, they hit them, and they all appear to sort of perish. But then, they have invaded a country, and these people are defending their country, and this is what you do in war. This is what happens. This is a video that again shows huge amounts of death and destruction, and you're seeing so many of these videos coming out, which leads me to believe that yes, the Russians are incurring some pretty significant losses. It's not just loss to human life and mechanized equipment, but but nature is suffering in this war. And here we see a fire near the front lines in the Yampol district. We've seen Serebyansky Forest affirms data there. The NASA satellite imagery showing that it was covered in fire recently, and it's obviously as the temperatures get warmer and vegetation is drier, fires are going to start like this, and no one's going to be up for stopping these wildfires in the middle of a war zone. You're not going to get the emergency services coming out here, and that will just burn until it's got nothing left to burn. It's sad. Right, there's an interesting article in the Business Insider concerning world weasel attacks. These are the use of usually multiple aircraft to fly and bait radar systems to turn on and acquire them as targets. So you're basically saying to the enemy, shoot at me, so that they turn their radar on and then give a radar signature, and then either you or other planes will then use radar-seeking missiles to blow up that air defense system. This is part of SEAD or SEED or DEAD, suppression of enemy air defense or destruction of enemy air defense missions that seek to do that. And they are high risk, of course, because you're saying, shoot at me, oh, you've shot at me, right? And hopefully that's, you might either release flares and chaff or have other planes to take out the missiles that come and go for you. But this is used to, obviously, to attrit enemy air defenses. So we're going to pop into this article and just have a little look at some of the things they say. Ukrainian pilots are flying dangerous wild weasel missions to suppress Russian air defenses. Advanced US weapons, supplied missiles, have played a critical role in these missions, and the arrival of F-16 fighter jets will help level out Russia's air superiority. So that's basically what the article is about. So HARM is the latest of these air-to-surface missiles, a projectile of around 770 pounds with a range of some 90 miles. These missiles can locate and strike enemy radar even after the radar systems have been turned off. HARM have been used in wars in Libya, Iraq, and former Yugoslavia. This experience is being put to use in Ukraine. Quote, Ukraine is learning from Western military thought, says Frederick Mertens, a strategic analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, telling Business Insider, quote, Ukraine is putting great emphasis on SEAD and DEAD missions. These missions can be, quote, very dangerous, especially for wild weasels, he said, but the Russian air defenses are a, quote, key target. Continuing, the game is worth the candle, Mertens said. But he added, Ukraine's tactics go far beyond the classic wild weasel missions of anti-radiation missile-equipped aircraft, from special forces raids to land-launched missiles like Gimlers and ATACMS, as well as drones of all sorts. Ukrainians use all weapons, troops, and systems that have at their disposal to suppress and destroy Russian air defenses, Mertens said. And this is where it gets. This is the interesting part for me. So, because we know most of this and we know this next bit, but I'm going to go on to talk about an interesting change in the way that these operations are used. So the difficulty of adapting HARM for Ukraine is due to the incompatibility of old Soviet-era jets such as MiG-29 and Su-27 fighters with modern Western technology. Last month, US Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment William LaPlante told reporters at a Washington, D.C. conference that Ukraine had been using iPads in an attempt to make Ukrainian jets compatible with Western weapons. I'd shown you that video with the iPad in the cockpit. He described how Ukraine's aging fighter planes could now take many Western weapons and get them to work on their aircraft as they were, quote, basically controlled by an iPad by the pilot. They're flying it in conflict like a week after we get it to them. So this is good. It shows that actually the Ukrainians are able to use Western weapons really quickly when they do get them and make them compatible, fairly promptly. Okay, since making the necessary adaptations, Ukrainian pilots have fired hundreds of HARMs at Russian air defense radar systems. However, their technique has changed. Justin Bronk, Senior Research Fellow for Air Power and Technology at the London-based think tank RUSI, quote, while they initially achieved a number of successful kills against Russian SAM systems and radars when first introduced, Russian SAM operators quickly adapted their tactics, Bronk said. Now HARM missiles serve a suppressive rather than a destructive purpose. When launched, quote, the missiles force Russian SAM operators to turn off their radars and relocate to avoid being hit by them, Bronk said. This leaves a short window within which other strike missiles like HIMARS rockets or Storm Shadow missiles can get through to nearby targets with much less risk of being intercepted by the Russian SAMs. So what this means is that initially they would use these HARM missiles to blow up radars, and that's your destruction of those. And that's brilliant. And then we can fire off and do what we want because we destroyed them. But now the Russians have adapted and they'll turn off their systems and then they'd scoot, get them out of dodge. But so the Ukrainians know this, so they go up on these wild weasel missions and they might fire off some missiles to scare off the Russian SAMs and radars. And then it allows a window for HIMARS to drive up, fire their missiles without getting shot down by the first echelon of air defenses, or it allows other airframes to fly and shoot off cruise missiles like Storm Shadow. For example, if you were trying to hit somewhere in Sevastopol and Crimea with Storm Shadows, you'd fly near the Kherson or Zaporizhia front lines in a wild weasel mission to get the Russian radars to turn off and scoot out the way. And while they're doing that, other airframes might come up with Storm Shadows, fire them off with decoys, like the MALD decoy missiles. And then those decoys that usually go first would then bait further echelons of air defense in Crimea, maybe Zhankoy, and that will shoot down the decoy missiles, and then the Storm Shadows can get through. So you've basically done your wild weasels, your decoys, and then your actual missiles get through and take out your targets in in Sevastopol, for example. That's how I'd understand it. So they're being used slightly differently. They're not destroying, but they are suppressing. They're changing the behaviour of the Russian air defences. Right, distant strikes. There have been quite a lot of drones flying into Russia last night. Don't know of any details of any destruction other than an electrical substation in Lipetsk that's on fire. Russian governor claims that all drones were shot down, though, also in Kursk and Belgorod regions. Well, Kyiv Independent says the Russian governor claims a fire at a substation at Lipetsk after overnight drone attack. They've claimed to have shot down 31 drones. So that's 4 over Lipetsk, 12 over Belgorod, 8 over Kursk, and 7 over occupied Crimea, according to Russian Defense Ministry. So they shot everything down. That hardly ever happens. There will be damage to Russian infrastructure somewhere. We know that of a substation so far. I'm sure there'll be more. Luhansk region, an ammo depot appears to be blowing up and having some pretty significant secondary cook-offs. Secondary explosions still taking place there. So that has been hit by probably Gimlers, a guided multiple launch rocket into Luhansk region somewhere there. Quite a lot of footage about that. Just in general, Ukraine has a drone with a range of 1,500 kilometers. It's already being used to strike against Russia. The drone is called the Ninja. Now, I presume that's not that plain version of the drone that's being used, which has that kind of range as well. This sounds like it's another drone with 1,500 kilometer range. It has been used to attack the Gazprom refinery in Bashkiria. Up to 80% of all hits on Russian refineries are done by the Lyuty drone, which is that one with the twin tail that has been used a lot recently. So, you can see 80% of the hits on Russian refineries are done with them. On the other hand, the Russians are hitting Odessa. So that is certainly a challenge for the Ukrainians. This is, I did have a post talking about this. No, damn, I've lost it from Exit, talking about the strikes on Odessa. That she was saying that these strikes take months to rebuild the infrastructure that is destroyed after these strikes. And that's happening all over Ukraine with lots of different agricultural targets being taken out. And that can take months and months to sort out, rather like the Russian oil refineries, obviously taking an awful lot of work and effort to get back online. The issues that Russians have is that they are sanctioned and can't get hold of arguably many of the parts of those refineries. But here, at least $1.5 million in damages resulted from the recent missile attack on a Singaporean agro-industrial enterprise in Odessa. The attack destroyed 10 storage tanks for finished agricultural products and caused the loss of over 10,000 tons of vegetable oil. Additionally, it resulted in contamination of land and vegetable oil across more than 3,000 square meters. No one wants all sorts of, vegetable oil is natural, but you don't want thousands of tons of that spilling onto the land. It will contaminate the land. Now, what's interesting for me here is what happens when a third-party nation or an entity from another nation has their stuff destroyed. So what does Singapore do here if they are having, essentially this is Singaporean infrastructure that is in Ukraine being hit by the Russians, and that is money being taken from the Singaporean purse. Like, they will get tax money for this, except they won't now because Russia's struck it. So what happens here? Like, is this breaking international law with regard to a war? It's a difficult concept anyway. I mean, I always find, as much as I like the Geneva Convention, I also find it really bizarre that you can say, right, we're going to do war, we're going to kill people, but we're going to set laws around that to make sure we don't kill people in this way, but we kill them in that way. And we don't blow up these things, but we blow up those things. So it's kind of like, it just seems like odd making moral laws around war. War is just inherently morally problematic, but nonetheless, let's assume that the Geneva Convention and such like are obviously a step in the right direction. What's the situation here with countries like Singapore? Obviously, Singapore's not a hugely militaristic country that's going to be able to, but it's got a decent enough economy, and should they do anything? Can they do anything? What is what is a precedent for doing anything about having your own infrastructure and entities getting struck in a war purposefully by one side. On the other hand, Grant Shapps here, the UK defense minister, saying that as the Black Sea increasingly becomes a no-go area for Putin's navy, Ukrainian grain exports are increasing and helping to put their economy on a firmer war footing. In recent months, grain has been exported, more has been exported than any time since the outbreak of the war. And he then shows this graph, or the Ministry of Defense shows this graph, which is this is what happened with the grain exports. So the start of the war in February 2022. So you had big grain exports, and it dropped here, and then boom, they bottomed out, and then nothing was exported. And then you had 2022 to 2023, and you had this blue line showing, okay, they got the grain deal working, but then the grain deal came to an end, and that meant that there was nothing being exported because Russia said no, we're not going to do the grain deal. And then we had lots of people getting involved to enable this passage corridor from Odessa area down the coastline of the Black Sea, Bulgaria, Romania, out the Bosphorus Straits in Istanbul, out into the Mediterranean. And this then allowed Ukraine to then get their grain exporting back up to now at a level that surpasses the any point during the beginning of the war. So that there was, just before the start of the war, they've got up to that point. So since the war started, they are now, Ukraine is now exporting more. That is really, really good news. As the UK Ministry of Defence says, the Ukrainian Ministry of Economy announced that the total exports for March amounted to approximately 12 million tonnes, which is more than at any other point during the war. So good news. On the one hand, yep, they are getting Odessa hammered, and you can see why, because this is allowing Ukraine to prosecute a defensive war by getting money through one of their biggest sources of income. Ukraine is shooting down far smaller proportion of Russian missiles than it was earlier in the war, according to Wall Street Journal. I've reported this before, but there's a nice, simple graph to show this. Kyiv is running low on ammunition for Western supply Patriot systems that have been its best defense against such attacks. In the past 6 months, Ukraine has intercepted around 46% of Russian missiles, compared with 73% in the previous 6-month period. This might be to do with interceptors, a lack of ammunition for things like Patriots, but remember, it could also be Russians adapting and sending more Iskander-Ms and Kinzhal, these ballistic missiles that have a much lower chance of being shot down. So I think there is probably a change in Russian missile behavior, and also a change in their routes that they're using. They are learning. The Russians do obviously learn and improve throughout the war. Right, we're now going to go and talk about, first of all, what's going on in Kharkiv. I'm going to have some tea. So there has been, as you can see from this map, deep state map, it's actually slowed down a bit, and this is, very little movement around Vovchansk, and then some movement in the more westerly salient there over the last day compared to the 36 hours before that. And I think that shows that the Russians are going to be coming up against Ukrainian fortifications. There's all these complaints that there are no fortifications, and then people like myself going, well, you can't expect fortifications to be within 5 kilometers of the border because, it's under drone, mortar and artillery fire and in that range, and so you're not going to send US excavators. Yeah, but the Russians did it down on the southern front. Yeah, but that was at the time when the Ukrainians didn't have any artillery. If you remember, that's before the counteroffensive, and everyone was whining that there was no artillery ammunition for up at places like Bakhmut and all over the shop. Bakhmut was happening. It was all like very tough for the Ukrainians, but they were stockpiling ammunition for the counteroffensive. Now, you could say they should have stopped the Russians from building those fortifications. Hindsight, of course, 2020 vision. But the Russians were able to build those fortifications outside of the range, really, of artillery and drones. So those ones going all the way back to Tokmak, they had 3 echelons. And you could say that the ones closer to the front line were able to build them, but Ukraine has a fraction of and had a fraction of the artillery ammunition and pieces that the Russians had. the Russians have artillery the other side of the border that can't be hit with Western munitions, right? And so the Ukrainians are just unlikely to build fortifications within 5 kilometers of the border. It's just that simple. Yet people are saying, oh, what, the Russians have just walked into this area. They've walked into a grey zone, which is not really defended. Anyway, the official statement of the commander of the 125th Separate Ground Defence Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine regarding combat operations in Kharkiv, quote, information about the unpreparedness of the defence forces for an enemy attack, or even worse, about the retreat of individual units from the defensive line entrusted to them is a frank ipso. So it's just not true. The settlements entered by the enemy were a permanent grey zone, and therefore the enemy's success is quite conditional and costs him huge losses in equipment and manpower. So the claims are that they are losing lots of troops, and then there is lots of visual evidence. I know this video is from the Eastern Front, but there is lots of visual evidence of the Russians losing lots of troops in this area. In other words, his claims appear to be backed up here, all the claims 125th here. Territory occupied by the enemy is localised and constant fire damage is carried out on it. Units 125th Regiment, the Armed Forces of Ukraine, repel the overwhelming forces of the enemy, maintaining constancy in combat formations. So that's what he says. And then we've got Yuri Butasov, who is a Russian... sorry, no, he's not. He's a Ukrainian journalist here. Who is, that's really frustrating, it's happening again, who is a Ukrainian journalist who is often quite critical about Ukraine, and here is saying somewhat positive things, or at least it's not all in doom and gloom. He's been positioned previously at Chasiv Yar and, not Chasiv Yar, Bakhmut, during the Bakhmut offensive from the Russians, and Avdiivka, and he kind of tells it like it is. So the fact that he's being somewhat positive here is, I think, a good sign. So as Dmitry from Wall Translated says, to hear something like that from Butasov himself is rather optimistic. So Rob Lee says Yuri Butasov's assessment of the situation in Kharkiv Oblast, he says that Russian advances have slowed now that they are running into defensive positions and their losses are increasing, though he says that some of the existing formations were built in the wrong locations. He says the command of the OTU Kharkiv has been replaced and the situation is complex but improving. Previously I read this to you. Generally that is what is said. Let's go and have a look at a little bit of this. In the direction of Vovchansk, the enemy entered the outskirts of the town on its outer streets and the meat processing plant there, but the city remains practically completely under our control. Advancing deep into the enemy has not been allowed. Under Vovchansk, I don't know what that means, our artillery and drones effectively work on infantry, and the losses of the opponent are significant. I'm here, so I see the situation with my own eyes. The city is stepping up defense. The enemy is actively acting. Groups of infantry are trying to penetrate our combat orders in different areas. Several tanks have tried to attack but been repelled. Russians have tried to advance, but everywhere they're met with resistance of Ukrainian troops, and now the enemy is forced to conduct attacks. Faced with the elimination of our combat orders and the need to attack strong points and prevent further advancement, the enemy lost the ability to maneuver, and now the losses of the Russians begin to grow sharply. This is all really significant stuff. I think the Russians are going to find this difficult. But yeah, so lots more to say there. You can pause the video and read it yourself. It's not all going Ukraine's way. There is claims of a bit of chaos happening, and then commanders being changed, and then things looking better, etc., etc. The Institute for the Study of War says their analysis is that partly the issue is Western allies not allowing Ukrainian forces permission to strike within Russia. So you've got these attacks coming from Russia where you've got accumulation of Russian troops and equipment, and you can't hit them with HIMARS and whatnot. And so they then disperse into Ukraine, and then you're having to hit them bit by bit over here, in Ukraine, while they're sort of in doing maneuvers or in houses or whatever. But actually, it would have been better to strike them up here. But we can't do that with the weapons we want to do it with, because actually, the restrictions have been put on them. either geofencing from the equipment itself, or the agreement has been made that they won't use them in those situations. And this is what the ISW is basically saying. Russian forces are reaping the benefits of the West's long-term restriction on Ukraine using Western-provided weapons to strike legitimate military targets on Russian territory that Russian forces now depend on to sustain their offensive operations in northern Kharkiv. So they have sanctuary. They've got sanctuary areas that the West is basically allowing them. Right, moving on from Kharkiv, we know that Sergei Shoigu has been moved sideways, potentially up, but I don't really think so. So Shoigu's not been promoted because he's done good stuff, right? Patrushev, who is Putin's really close ally, has been moved from his position as senior security advisor to Putin, which is a really, top position. Shoigu's moved into that position, and then a guy from the economy minister, I think, has been moved into the position of defense minister. So Putin spokesman Belousov has been appointed defense minister to integrate military industrial complex into the economy. Russian dictator Putin's spokesperson Peskov said on May the 12th that Putin had decided to appoint Belousov since the ministry, quote, should be open to innovation and progressive ideas. He went on to praise Belousov's performance as economy minister and cited the reason for his appointment. Commenting on Belousov's tasks, he said that Russia's defense and security budget had risen from 3% to 6.7% of the GDP, and it's important to integrate the military-industrial complex into the country's economy. So, yeah, that's it. I think it's possibly more important to understand what's gone on with Patrushev. So if he's gone, or has he been moved to a different position, that's important, or what I do, you don't fix what ain't broken, so something's broken here, I would assume. Something's suboptimal, not operating as well as Russia would like. And that's a reflection on how the war is going. But that Patrushev, who's someone that's been with Putin since early days in the KGB, Putin was never this strong KGB agent that everyone's like, oh, here's a great leader, let's have him. And I think in the early days, Putin was, say, mayor of St. Petersburg because he's maybe manipulatable. And then he had this situation where he then became, prime minister, president, whatever, the flipping between those two. And you had this emergence of a leader that ended up becoming this strong dictator. The question is whether he was put in place by the FSB and other entities and is still in that position, having his strings pulled by people underneath the Kremlin, the FSB and Slovakia and whatever, or whether Putin has emerged from that to be this powerful dictator that came out of this surprisingly. I was reading Owen Matthews' Overreach, and there's this idea that, Putin, we weren't expecting him to be like that from inside Russia. Some people not expecting, and you had this with Angela Merkel and many in Europe thinking, well, Putin's this reformer, we can accept him into our fold and change Russia by osmosis. And I think that was a fair enough project, and it failed. And because people misjudged Putin, but it wasn't just, I think, Europeans that did that. I think it was Russians as well. So there's this idea that Putin is this, surprisingly, has become this dictator that is ruthless and gets rid of people around him and has morphed from who might have been a reformer in maybe similar to Gorbachev, but actually is just sees Peter the Great and other Russian historical characters as these idols and wants Russia to get back to this era of greatness, and therefore is becoming equally as imperialistic. And this is where we're at. So, like, Patrushev was one of those that was with Putin and was seen as more of that kind of forthright leader that you would have expected to have been president before Putin in the early days. But Putin ended up being this major leader, and Patrushev was his advisor. Well, if he's now gone, where's he gone, and what does that say? That's the important question. Anyway, enough of me rambling on that topic. So what else do we have to say? Russia is increasing taxes on a struggling energy giant Gazprom this year. Russia will increase taxes on its national energy giant, despite the company suffering record losses, according to the MED. Now, what does this tell us, right? If my goodness, I think this is massively important. So you've got you've got the major source of income from the hydrocarbons industry, Gazprom, making record losses in a year. So it's kind of on its knees in a sense. And then the Russian state comes along and says, and now we want more money from you next year. We're going to tax you more. You would never do that unless you were forced to do that. Russia would never do. It just doesn't make any sense unless Russia is desperate for money. Russia needs that money to keep prosecuting the war. And so it says, I'm sorry, mate, I know you made losses next year, but we need more money out of you. We're going to tax you even more. And Gazprom's like, yeah, kick a man while he's down. Well, does that approach, does my synopsis make sense? Well, when you start looking at other things, and JR sent me this is a Dutch piece. Thanks, mate. When you look at other pieces of the jigsaw, you do end up creating a picture that is very much that Russia is in financial, economic trouble. So the Russian elite is afraid. Putin nationalizes companies of disloyal oligarchs. Is Putin purging the old elite? Dozens of large companies run by disloyal oligarchs are nationalized and involved in the war economy. The message is don't resist the Kremlin. Steel mills, chemical companies, logistics, and other parts of the military-industrial complex. The food industry, and yes, even the largest importer of cars. No sector seems immune to the new wave of nationalizations that has engulfed Russia since the beginning of this year and is making more and more wealthy businessmen nervous. So in 1991, in the breakup of the Soviet Union, you had the Russian Federation dabbling with democracy and capitalism. And of course, it failed. Democracy failed and we're back to a dictatorship, and capitalism failed. We became an oligarchy fairly quickly where there was no real competition and the money was concentrated in very few elites at the top, of which Putin himself was taking a cut. So it's a kleptocracy where he's stealing from the state, from the people, and not reinvesting that in the people. He's building super yachts and palaces and whatnot. So this is a very poor form of capitalism. But there are still elements of the free market where, well, of the oligarchy, where oligarchs are saying, so an oligarchy is just like a cartel, like it's just few people running all the kind of free market enterprises that aren't that free because it's only run by few people, that the competition isn't really there. And so that's the situation. But now you're getting the state, the Kremlin, Putin's Kremlin, taking back chunks and chunks of the capitalist landscape back to state control, and you're moving towards a command economy, a wartime command economy, with strategic planning, rather like communist times. So at the end of March, the article continues, for example, Russian prosecutors in Chelyabinsk, central Russia, announced on the same day that they had filed a lawsuit against two major Russian companies with the intention of transferring ownership to the Russian state. Makfa JSC, and the country's largest pasta producer, and Ariant, the largest winemaker. So these are very little to do with the war, right? But it's saying, we're going to have that because you're being a little bit, I don't know, a bit difficult as an oligarch, and I'm not sure that you're on our side here. And if times are tough, I can see you creating some trouble. So we're going to just take all of that from you, and that means that we get that money. We're not going to tax you. We're not going to tax the profits of this organization and maybe get like 10% or 20% of what you make. We're going to take it all and we're going to get 100% of what you make because we need that. So on the one hand, this is a political move to stymie dissent, arguably. But I think more importantly, it's an economic move because they are absolutely desperate for that money. Together, those two entities account for an estimated value of 500 million euros. The article continues later. Antipov, who's an oligarch, is far from the only one targeted by Putin. According to figures from Transparency International Russia and Novaya Gazeta, at least 40 deprivation procedures have been initiated since the start of the war, with a total of at least 180 companies being re-owned by the Russian government. Newspaper RBC, based in Moscow, even mentions 55 files. I'm not sure what the translation might be weird there. According to Transparency International, the focus of the nationalizations is not only on the defense sector, over which Kremlin clearly wants more control. Valuable assets and land in Moscow and St. Petersburg, as well as companies with valuable factories and properties in southern Russia, are also increasingly in the Kremlin sights. According to figures from Igor Krasnov, the top prosecutor in Russia, 1 trillion rubles, more than 10 billion euros worth of strategic assets, have been nationalized since the start of the war. According to Nicholas Trickett, a senior analyst at Standard & Poor's, this is a deliberate strategy. Quote, where the state once plundered the pockets of foreign investors, the hunt is now open at home, he told the Kremlin critical newspaper, the Moscow Times. So on and so forth, lots more detail. But the idea is that what does this tell us? What's going on? But, why does anything happen? Like, why is Patrushev being moved? Why is Shoigu being moved? Is this a sign of good things, or is this a sign of bad things in Russia? And here, why are they taking back control? Because they need the money and they're trying to stifle dissent. So it means that there might be growing dissent and they're desperate for money, which doesn't look good for Russia. So I think stuff like this is good news for Ukraine. Just a couple of bits while I was while I paused the video a second ago, just to add to the hits and losses. When we're looking at record numbers, you're thinking, how come there's record numbers? Here's an incredible bit of footage. I won't show it to you. It's on Getty. But you've got 20 soldiers going into this one building here, all into that door, essentially into the building, and then that building gets hit by a single drone, right? And the drone flies through that window. You can see just that thin window at the bottom of the building, just here. You've got people going in there, and then people going in this door. And then you've got that drone there, flies through that window, and that entire building blows up. I don't know whether that's just the drone. If that's just a drone, that's an insane amount of firepower on that drone, or whether there's ammunition in there that blows up. But that building ends up becoming no more, essentially inside. Roof kind of lifts up and then comes down, and has some serious explosive capability. And there's 20 Russians, arguably, that are dead or injured, added just in one little drone strike. So again, are these figures from the Ukrainian General Staff realistic? Well, we've got some fairly good evidence to suggest that they're in the right direction. On the Crimea front is another video I hadn't seen until just now. Units of the 63rd Mechanized Brigade with assistance of the 60th Brigade repelled a fairly big Russian mechanized attack near Torska. So that's on the northeastern front to the west of Crimea. Roughly 10 units of Russian equipment were disabled, damaged or destroyed, among them 5 tanks and 5 BMPs. So when you've got a record day of 30 odd tanks being destroyed or disabled, 5 of them took place in one attack in Torska. Just there, just in this bit of tree line, there you've got 10 vehicles. So there's five of those. That's a sixth of the Russian tank losses, and that is an eighth of the Russian armored personnel vehicle losses. Just that one video. And then you multiply that across the front line, and that's in an area that's been quite quiet for the last week. So you look at what's going on in Chasiv Yar, Avdiivka, Novomikhailivka, Krasnohorivka, Velika Novosilka again, and Uruzhany, Robotina, Krenki, and now with massive attacks up near Kharkiv. These seem a lot more realistic. Anyway, that's enough from me. I've spoken way too long. But even with those extra 2 videos, I've cut 6 minutes off. So good for you guys. Thanks so much for watching. Take care. Speak soon.